The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets as a thick mist slowly crept in, blanketing the neighborhood in an eerie silence. In the fading light, the cracked pavement gleamed under the occasional flicker of a street lamp. The sound of distant sirens was a constant hum, but tonight the air felt heavier, more suffocating. The city, with all its noise and chaos, was somehow quieter, as if holding its breath. Kendra stood outside her modest townhouse, her dark silhouette blending into the night. She was a woman of resilience, shaped by years of struggle and perseverance. Her life had never been easy, but it was hers to navigate. As the only black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood, she had grown accustomed to the occasional curious gaze or dismissive whisper. But tonight something felt different, like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Her two German shepherds, Max and Zora, sat at her side, alert and watchful. They had always been more than just pets to Kendra. They were her protectors, her family. Max, the older of the two, had a calm yet intimidating presence, while Zora, his younger sister, was sharp-eyed and quick-witted, always ready to spring into action. Kendra's bond with them ran deep, a trust forged in the fires of hardship. They were her silent companions through every sleepless night and every challenge she faced. Tonight, however, it wasn't the usual evening walk. Kendra could feel it in her bones, the tension in the air, the uneasy energy that seemed to pulse through the streets. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the dimly lit surroundings, looking for anything out of place. A few houses down, a black SUV slowly rolled by, the engine's low rumble barely audible over the gentle wind. She didn't recognize the vehicle, but it wasn't unusual for strangers to pass through this neighborhood. It was, after all, a place of both safety and uncertainty. But then, the SUV stopped. For a moment it seemed to hover in place, as if the world had paused. The driver's side window lowered, and Kendra instinctively stepped back, clutching the leash tighter. From inside the vehicle, a man's voice called out, smooth and unsettling. "Evening, miss," he said, his tone carrying an air of false politeness. "Nice dogs you've got there. Are they trained?" Kendra's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the way he spoke, something insidious hidden beneath the surface. She didn't respond immediately, her instincts kicking in, but her gaze never left the vehicle. She had seen enough in her years to recognize a threat when it presented itself. Max growled softly at her side, his posture tense. Zora, too, stood poised, her body language a perfect mirror of her brother's. Protective, alert. Kendra's grip tightened on the leash, feeling the familiar weight of her dog's presence beside her. She had trained them both well, each one responding to her commands with unwavering loyalty. It was an unspoken understanding between them. The bond they shared was unbreakable. But now, as the man's gaze lingered on her and the dogs, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was no casual encounter. The man smirked as he leaned out of the car window, his eyes flicking over Kendra before settling on the dogs. "They look like they could do some real work," he said, his voice now taking on a more suggestive tone. "Maybe you'd be interested in putting them to use. We could make a deal. I know a few people who might appreciate their talents." Kendra's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of disbelief and anger rising in her chest. She had heard rumors about criminal gangs in the area, but never had she imagined they would approach her, a woman alone with two dogs, in such a direct manner. She didn't respond, instead stepping back, putting distance between herself and the car. Her eyes narrowed, and she felt Max shift beside her, his growl deepening. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she muttered under her breath, her voice low but firm. The man laughed, an unnerving sound that made her skin crawl. "Oh, I think I do," he said, his eyes flashing with recognition. "We know exactly who you are, Kendra, and we know exactly what you've got." Max and Zora's growls intensified, and Kendra's pulse quickened. She had never been one to back down, but she knew that this was no ordinary confrontation. The unease in her gut was undeniable, and as the SUV's engine revved up, the man's smile widened. "Think about it," he said. "We'll be seeing you around." With that, the vehicle slowly pulled away, its headlights cutting through the mist before disappearing into the night. Kendra stood frozen for a moment, her eyes fixed on the spot where the car had been. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with questions. Who were they? What did they want with her dogs? And most importantly, why had they come after her? She knew this wasn't over. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be easy to escape. She could feel it in her bones. She wasn't just a woman walking her dogs anymore. She was a target. And as the wind began to pick up, rattling the branches of the trees above, Kendra knew that her life was about to change forever. The faint sound of a distant car engine hummed in the background, and Kendra couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The dogs, too, seemed restless, their eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for something, or someone, to make their move. The city felt even more suffocating now, as if it was closing in on her, and she had no choice but to brace herself for whatever was coming next. Would she be ready for the storm? And would Max and Zora be enough to protect her from what lay ahead? The tension was thick in the air as Kendra turned toward her house, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The answers were just out of reach, but one thing was certain. The game had changed, and there was no turning back now. Kendra's thoughts raced as she stepped into the dimly lit hallway of her townhouse. The air felt colder inside, but she barely noticed. The door clicked shut behind her, its sound like a weight dropping into the silence. She leaned against it, her breath shallow, trying to steady herself. The encounter with the man in the SUV left her shaken, but she knew better than to show fear. Fear had no place in her life. It hadn't always been this way. Kendra wasn't born into strength. She wasn't born into power. She'd had to fight for everything she had. Every scrap of confidence, every piece of security. Born and raised in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Kendra learned early on that life wasn't kind to anyone, least of all someone like her. Being black and a woman in a world that often saw both as obstacles rather than assets had forced her to develop a resilience that few could understand. She had learned to walk with her head high, even when her back was pressed against the wall. Her mother, a soft-spoken woman with a steel core, had always been Kendra's guiding light. "Don't let anyone define you, Kendra," she used to say, her voice steady and unwavering. "Your worth isn't in their eyes, it's in your heart. And you, my girl, have a heart of steel." Her mother's words echoed in Kendra's mind now, but even the wisdom of years couldn't quiet the knot in her stomach. Kendra closed her eyes for a moment, leaning her head back against the door. The memories of her mother felt like a balm to her wounded soul, but they couldn't erase the fear creeping in. The world had changed since her mother passed away. She was alone now, with no one to turn to but Max and Zora. And the truth was, they weren't enough to shield her from everything. No matter how well-trained her dogs were, there were battles only she could fight. The sound of paws padding against the floor interrupted her thoughts. Max nudged her leg, his brown eyes filled with a silent understanding. Zora, ever the more vocal one, let out a soft whine, sensing the tension that still gripped her. Kendra knelt down, her fingers running through their fur. They were her only family now, her unwavering companions in a world that often felt too cold and too indifferent. She would do anything for them. And yet she couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. The knock on her door shattered the fragile silence. Kendra's body tensed, every muscle on alert. She glanced toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be? She opened the door slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway was Marcus, a longtime friend and neighbor. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face weathered by years of hard work and the occasional bad decision. But there was a warmth in his eyes, a steady kindness that Kendra had always appreciated. "You okay?" Marcus asked, his voice low but laced with concern. "I saw that SUV, heard the whole exchange. You don't have to tell me what happened, but I know when something's off. And tonight, it's off." Kendra hesitated, her mind spinning. She could see the genuine concern in his eyes, but a part of her wanted to shut the door and forget the world existed. She had learned, long ago, to handle things on her own. But Marcus wasn't just any neighbor. He had been there for her in the past, back when she'd first moved in, struggling to find her place in the neighborhood. He was the first person to offer help when her car broke down, the first to welcome her with a smile when she moved into the lonely townhouse. He had become a quiet constant in her life, always present when she needed him most. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little too firm. "It's nothing I can't handle." Marcus didn't buy it. He stepped into the doorway, looking past Kendra at the empty street beyond. "I don't know about that. Whoever they were, they seemed pretty damn confident. You sure you're not in over your head?" Kendra shifted, uncomfortably. She had never been one to show weakness, especially not to someone who had always been a friend. But Marcus was right. She wasn't fine. Not really. "I've been handling things for a long time, Marcus," she said, her voice softening. "I don't need anyone's help, not now, not ever." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Her walls were strong, but they weren't invincible. She had been alone before, but this was different. The threat that loomed now was darker, more dangerous. "I'm just worried, Kendra," Marcus said, his tone gentle. "You've been through a lot, and I know you've got your pride, but you don't have to face everything alone. You've got people here who care about you. I care about you." Kendra felt her breath hitch, but she held it back. This wasn't the time for emotional vulnerability. She had worked too hard to get to where she was, and letting anyone in now would only make her more vulnerable. The last thing she needed was to rely on someone else. She had fought too hard for her independence, for her strength. But as she looked at Marcus, her heart ached with a quiet longing. She had always pushed people away, always kept them at arm's length, but Marcus, he was different. "I know you mean well," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But I can't risk it. You don't understand what it's like." Marcus didn't respond right away. He just stood there studying her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay, but don't think you can fool me into believing you're fine. You've got someone watching your back whether you like it or not, and you can't outrun that." Kendra swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Before she could respond, Marcus gave her a small nod, his eyes flicking, to Max and Zora. "You take care of yourself, all right? I'll be around if you need anything." As he walked away, Kendra closed the door and leaned against it again. She was still shaken, still restless, her thoughts a tangled mess. Marcus's words hung heavy in her mind, and as she turned back to the dogs, she saw the same unease in their eyes. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones like a storm on the horizon. The knock had been a warning. But Kendra didn't know yet who was truly coming for her, or why they had targeted her. What did they want with her dogs? What did they know about her, and more importantly, how much longer could she face this alone? The pieces didn't fit, and yet she could sense that something was about to change, something bigger than she could control. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed to grow louder, as though it were waiting for her next move. And as Kendra gazed out the window, the faintest sound of tires rolling across wet pavement echoed in the distance, sending a chill down her spine. The days following the encounter with the man in the SUV passed in a haze. Kendra's life, once a rhythm of routine, had been thrown off course. The oppressive feeling that something was wrong lingered in the air, clinging to every shadow, every rustling leaf. She couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every corner she turned, every unfamiliar car parked along the street, every hushed conversation between neighbors, it all seemed to fuel the sense of danger that had settled in her gut. But Kendra was no stranger to adversity. The city had never been kind to her, and the world had always been quick to underestimate her, to look down on her as just another woman of color trying to carve out her place in a space where she didn't belong. She had fought her way through. Every obstacle life had thrown her way, and she wasn't about to back down now. But the questions kept swirling in her mind. Who were these people? Why had they targeted her? And why did they want her dogs? Max and Zora were her constant companions, her strength in the face of uncertainty. She spent hours with them, training, walking, and talking to them as if they could understand her every word. It was her way of grounding herself, of finding some semblance of control. But even they couldn't ease the tension that had wrapped itself around her heart like a vice. One afternoon, as Kendra walked with Max and Zora down the street, she saw the black SUV again. It was parked across the street, the engine running. Kendra's heart skipped a beat and she instinctively tightened her grip on the leashes. The windows were tinted, but she could feel the eyes of whoever was inside on her. Max growled softly, his hackles raised, while Zora's eyes darted nervously from the vehicle to Kendra. Without saying a word, Kendra turned sharply, steering the dogs back in the direction of her townhouse. Her pulse raced, but she didn't look back. They were watching. She knew it. But what were they waiting for? What did they want? The following evening, as Kendra sat alone at her kitchen table trying to sort through her scattered thoughts, she heard a knock at the door. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly she rose and walked to the door, her footsteps cautious, deliberate. When she opened it, there was no one there. Instead, there was a small envelope resting on the doorstep, sealed with a dark red wax. Kendra picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over. The front of the envelope had no return address, just her name, written in bold block letters. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation bearing down on her, but then she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a single line written in black ink. You know what's at stake. Meet us tomorrow. Same time. Same place. Kendra's mind raced. Meet us? Who were these people? What did they want from her? She glanced at the dogs who were lying at her feet, their eyes wary and alert. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The next day, as the sun began to set, Kendra found herself standing at the corner of the street where she had first encountered the SUV. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. Max and Zora were beside her, their bodies tense, their ears perked as they scanned the surroundings. Kendra couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap, but she had to find out who was behind this and what they wanted. As she stood there waiting, she noticed a figure in the distance. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, walking toward her. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but there was something about him that seemed familiar. Kendra's heart raced. Could it be the man from the SUV? Was this a trap? The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Kendra, he said, his voice low and gravelly. I'm surprised you actually showed up. She straightened, her heart pounding in her chest. Who are you? She demanded, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. What do you want from me? The man smiled, but it was a cold, almost predatory smile. I think you already know, he said. You've got something we want and you're going to give it to us. Kendra's eyes flicked to Max and Zora, who were standing by her side, their bodies tense, their instincts on high alert. I don't know what you're talking about, she replied, her voice firm. I'm not afraid of you. The man's smile widened, his eyes glinting with amusement. Oh, you will be, he said softly. You'll learn soon enough. Before Kendra could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Her mind was racing. What did he mean? What was he talking about? She had no idea, but the fear that had been building in her chest was now palpable, and the sense of dread that had been growing within her intensified. Kendra returned home that night, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed, her mind replaying every word the man had said. What had he meant by, "You'll learn soon enough"? What did they want from her? And why had they targeted her? She rose from her bed, unable to quiet the storm of thoughts in her head. She walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. The city was quiet. Too quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As she paced the floor, she suddenly recalled something her mother had told her years ago, back when she was just a teenager trying to navigate a world that seemed determined to break her. Strength comes from within, Kendra, her mother had said. her voice filled with quiet wisdom. It doesn't come from the people around you, it doesn't come from the world. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. You are your own protector. Always remember that. Kendra closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting the memory wash over her. Her mother had been right. She was her own protector. And whatever this was, whatever they wanted, she wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. With newfound resolve, Kendra turned and walked to the door, her eyes locking with Max and Zora. "Stay close, you two," she whispered. She wasn't sure what was coming, but she knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As she stepped outside into the cool night, the city seemed even darker now, the shadows deeper. She could hear the faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional sound of footsteps echoing in the silence. But there was something else, too. Something that sent a chill down her spine. She wasn't alone. A figure stood at the edge of the street watching her. This time, Kendra didn't hesitate. The danger was real, and whatever had been set into motion was moving faster than she could keep up with. She could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on her, but she was done running. She was done hiding. "What do you want from me?" she called out, her voice steady despite the rising fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they stepped forward, their face still hidden in the darkness. Kendra's heart skipped a beat, and Max and Zora's low growls filled the air. The figure raised their hand, and Kendra's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The game had changed. The figure stepped forward into the dim light, and Kendra's heart pounded in her chest. Max and Zora instinctively moved closer to her, their muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. Kendra tightened her grip on their leashes, trying to steady her breath as she faced the unknown. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet stayed rooted in place. She couldn't show fear, not now. Not after everything she had been through. The figure, still obscured in shadows, didn't speak. Instead, they took another step forward, their presence radiating an unsettling calm. Kendra's mind raced, searching for a way out, a strategy, but her options were limited. She had no idea who this person was, but the intensity in the air told her this wasn't just another threat. This was the real thing. "I don't know who you are, but you need to leave," Kendra said, her voice barely masking the unease coursing through her. "This is your last warning." The figure paused, their outline still indistinct in the night, but Kendra could sense the quiet amusement in their stance. They weren't scared. They weren't intimidated. They were toying with her. "You don't get it, do you?" the voice finally said. It was low, smooth, but there was a chilling edge to it. "You don't have a choice in this. You're already in deeper than you know." Kendra's fists clenched, but she didn't back down. "If you think I'm just going to roll over for you, you're wrong," she said, her tone sharp. She reached for the small blade she kept tucked in her waistband, a precaution she had taken ever since the threats had started. It was small, inconspicuous, but sharp. Her hands were steady as she pulled it out, holding it just below her waist where it wouldn't be visible unless she needed it. The figure didn't flinch. They didn't even blink. In fact, they stepped forward again, closer this time. Max growled, and Zora's ears perked as the tension in the air grew unbearable. "You think you can fight us off?" the figure asked, their voice dripping with condescension. "You're playing a game you can't win, and your little dogs won't be enough to save you this time." The words hit Kendra like a punch to the gut. She had been pushed, provoked, tested time and time again, but hearing them speak about her dogs, her family, made something inside her snap. The animals she had loved, trained and protected, were now a target. The rage she had been suppressing for so long boiled over. "Don't you ever talk about my dogs like that," she shouted, her voice shaking with fury. But there was something else now, something sharper beneath the anger. Fear. She couldn't help it. What if this was it? What if she was in over her head? The figure's lips curled into a wicked smile, and before Kendra could react, they lunged forward, faster than she anticipated. Max and Zora immediately surged into action, their teeth bared, but the figure dodged them with unnatural speed, slipping past the dogs as though they were nothing more than obstacles. Kendra's heart hammered in her chest as the figure closed, the distance between them, their hands shooting out to grab her wrist. Her blade slipped from her grasp as she was pulled forward, nearly off balance. Max barked and lunged, but the figure swiftly kicked him back, sending him crashing to the ground. Zora, too, was knocked away with a brutal shove. Kendra barely had time to register what was happening before she was pinned against the cold brick wall of the townhouse, her breath knocked from her lungs. "You don't understand," the figure hissed, their breath hot against her ear. "This is bigger than you. You're just a pawn. And those dogs of yours? They're part of the game now, too." Kendra's mind raced, her pulse thundering in her ears. She struggled against their grip, but it was like trying to break free from iron chains. The figure's strength was terrifying, inhuman even. Kendra had faced physical threats before, but never like this. This wasn't just a fight, it felt like an execution. They weren't here to negotiate or intimidate. They were here to break her, but Kendra refused to break. With a forceful jerk, she twisted in their grip, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she slammed her knee into the figure's stomach. The move caught them off guard, just for a second, but it was enough. The figure staggered back, momentarily loosening their hold. Kendra didn't waste a second. She scrambled for the blade, her fingers trembling as she grasped it, feeling its familiar weight in her hand. The figure recovered quickly, their eyes flashing with irritation, but Kendra was already on the offensive. She slashed with the knife, aiming for the figure's torso. But they were too fast, ducking and weaving with an agility that was almost unnatural. Kendra's breath came in ragged gasps, but she couldn't afford to let up. She had to protect herself, her dogs, her life. She was standing on the edge now, with nowhere to go but forward. Every instinct she had told her to keep fighting, to not give in. With a growl, the figure lunged again, this time catching her wrist in a vice-like grip that crushed her bones. The blade slipped from her hand as pain shot up her arm. She gritted her teeth against the agony, but her thoughts were clouded. She needed to think, to find a way out of this. "You're not getting away," the figure snarled, their voice dripping with venom. Kendra's vision blurred, but she refused to let it end like this. She couldn't. Not after everything she had fought for. She remembered her mother's words. Strength comes from within. And in that moment, she knew that if she was going to survive this, it would be because of her. Only her. In a flash of desperation, Kendra wrenched her arm free, using the last of her strength to slam her shoulder into the figure's chest, knocking them back. For just a split second, they faltered, and Kendra took advantage of the opening. She rushed toward Max and Zora, who were slowly recovering from their initial shock, and grabbed their leashes, pulling them toward her. "Let's go," she shouted, her voice hoarse but determined. The figure regained their balance just as Kendra turned, but it was too late. She was already moving, pulling the dogs behind her. But before she could make it back to the safety of her townhouse, she heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving in the distance. A black SUV. The same SUV from before. Kendra's blood ran cold as the vehicle sped toward them, its headlights glaring through the mist. The figure behind her was no longer a shadow. They were real, they were here, and they were closing in fast. Kendra's pulse quickened. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, who the hell were they? But there was no time for answers. Only survival. With the dogs in tow, Kendra sprinted toward the alleyway, hoping to lose the vehicle in the maze of narrow streets. But her heart knew. It wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about confronting the truth. About finding out exactly what kind of fight she had signed up for. And it was a fight she wasn't sure she could win. As the sound of the SUV's engine grew louder, Kendra's mind raced, her thoughts scattered. Her body was exhausted, but her resolve was stronger than ever. The streets seemed to narrow around her as she ran, her legs burning with every step. She had no plan, no strategy, but she wasn't about to stop. Not now, not when the danger was this close.